Thank you all for coming. It's a really nice crowd. I'm very pleased to see that. And welcome to the ITI CIRI webinar seminar series. This particular seminar will be conducted by Major General Richard J. Hayes, who is the Adjutant General for the state of Illinois. General Hayes will be discussing cyber as a warfare domain and what the Department of Defense and the National Guard are doing to defend and protect the nation from cyber attacks, with critical infrastructure as its nexus. And of course, Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute, this is very, very germane to our research domain. By way of background, I'd like to introduce Major General Richard J. Hayes, Jr., who serves as the commander of the Illinois National Guard. And he serves also as the Adjutant General and the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, and is a cabinet member for the governor of the state of Illinois. As Commander and Adjutant General, General Hayes is responsible for developing and coordinating all policies and programs and plans in joint matters that affect the Illinois National Guard's 13,000 Army and Air National Guard personnel. General Hayes is a nationally recognized expert in matters of defense support of civil authorities and has published numerous papers on improving the resilience of the nation in response to Stafford Act events. General Hayes is an active member with the Electric Infrastructure Security Council and serves as a member of the Illinois Executive Committee for Cybersecurity. And we're very proud to say that he also serves on the CIRI Executive Advisory Board. And without any further ado, General Hayes.
Hey, thanks, Randy. Well, good afternoon. It's fun for me. I don't get to do this too often. So I'm excited to be here. This is a larger crowd than I guess I was expecting. Hopefully I can live up to your expectations. One thing I do want to tell you, I'm not going to be real technical here. That's not the purpose of my speech. So if you're expecting to come here and talk about zeros and ones, I'm not going to get into that. But what I am going to get into is cyber is part of it. And you think about warfare in general, you have land warfare, you have airfare or warfare in air, airspace, sea-based, naval. You have space, and then you have cyber. And cyber, I would tell you 10 years ago, was on the radar of the Department of Defense, but it wasn't looked at as a domain of warfare or a place that attacks could occur. Clearly, our thought process has matured rapidly in that area. And I think a lot of it is a proliferation of the internet. And so I'm going to try and talk about all those things, but tie it back to what I think enables our economy. Critical infrastructure enables our economy, which enables our elements of power, and correspondingly also provides for our very well-being. Go back 150 years ago, we didn't really have electricity, did we? How many of you know what it was like to live 150 years ago? I have a little bit of an inkling every time I go out in the field, or when you go camping, you have an idea. But I want to talk about why this topic is so important. As I go along, I've got, when you see one of these slides with the black background, that's kind of my topical pause. I'm going to kind of pause there. And if you have questions at that point, I'll be glad to answer them. If you want to wait to the end, that's fine as well. So a little bit of background to me, and Randy kind of highlighted it for you. I've been in the reserves most of my military career, on and off active duty, and now I'm back working for the military full-time, have been since 2013. But for 27 years, I worked in the engineering construction space, designing and constructing critical infrastructure around the nation. A good half of my career was in the power sector, power plants, transmission, distribution. And so I have a lot of insight to a lot of things related to that. And then you couple it with my military career. I'm a field artillery officer. So if you go back to 1985, I hate to say it, it's a long time ago, field artillery was the first branch in the military, inside the Army, I should say, that went to digital fire control. We were able to conduct fires digitally. And that was all done on our frequency modulating FM devices, frequency hop encrypted. So we were like the first leading edge cyber in the Army back then to deliver fires in a more timely manner. And so I, as a kid, 1980, got my first Apple IIe don't know if you ever remember what that's. Some of you are shaking your head, or at least know of it. But that was the cool thing. My parents got an Apple IIe, and so I got really interested in computers. And in college, I got believe it or not, my undergrad degree was in geography, but geographic information systems. And in 85, 86, 87, there was very few jobs in that area because the models for GIS had not, and the only people that were hiring were the likes of CIA, DIA, and sorts. So I ended up not going into it and jumped into construction largely as a function. I had worked construction during the summers to make a lot of money to help pay for school, along with ROTC. Anyways, but I am concerned personally about the resiliency of our nation as it relates to our critical infrastructure. Hence, CIRI, I'm a big fan of what CIRI's mission is here at the University of Illinois, working around the country. And in 2005, I was at the Army War College, and the Army War College is the college you got to go to get to be a general. I mean, in a nutshell, but it's the most senior service college we have, and you have to pick something to talk about, to write about your thesis that ties to an element of power of the United States. And diplomatic, informational, military, and economic are the four elements of power that, at least in the circles of the military, we talk are elements of power. And I reflected on it, I said, well, wait a minute, DIME, we use the term DIME, easy to remember. What enables all those elements of power? And it's the economy. If you don't have the money, you're not going to be able to have a great military. You're not going to be able to have the diplomatic footprint you have around the world, and certainly you're not going to be able to analyze or generate information to further and better the world. So as I thought about that, I said, well, how would you destroy the U.S. economy? Well, if you somehow affected our critical infrastructure. So I wrote my master's thesis on it, and it was entitled Terrorism and Critical Electric Infrastructure in the United States and Implications and Consequences on the Economy. Never was published. Why? Too much good stuff in the paper. Nonetheless, I've had this passion around it, and since I wrote that paper, I've been doing everything I can to educate why this is a concern, and henceforth you're just another great group of American citizens, and I'm going to try and show you why this isn't so important. So I want to acknowledge these are just solely my views. I'm not representing the Department of Defense today. I'm representing Rich Hayes, and so these are solely my experience and my views on this topic. However, they're pretty informed views on the topic, so get that out of the way. So I love this slide. So there's many websites in many in the room. How many in the room are IT or cyber? Okay, good. Well, you guys know what I'm talking about. You can go out, there's many sites you can go to and look at what cyber attacks are occurring across different protocols. This is 1 second in time, as I call it. Interestingly enough, here, this firm, you guys know who those guys are, right? It's a Russian firm that makes antivirus software. Well, this is at their website. Well, the US government just said nobody can use this stuff anymore. I remember buying a laptop for my wife a few years ago at Best Buy. Free software. Well, unless it's US made, I have a problem using anybody's free anything. So nonetheless, but that's just 1 second. And you can look how concentrated it was in Europe. Well, this was the middle of the day in the United States, and that's nighttime in Europe. Everybody's kind of probing at night, aren't they? It's kind of interesting. But anyways, it's going on all over the world. So this is how we in the Department of Defense and the National Guard kind of look at the cyber attack lifecycle or kill chain. You got to recon your target, right? You got to weaponize. In other words, you got to have something to deliver. If you want to attack it, you got to have something to deliver. You deliver that capability, whether or not it explodes at the time or not, and I use that in a generic sense, but the weapon at some point is going to have some sort of effects. Then you exploit what you're after, and then obviously you directed the victim to take actions, or you distracted the victim. And then correspondingly execute, and then ensure future access. A lot of the cyber things that we're seeing are things that are planted with a future intended purpose that never get executed. And that's where we get lulled as a nation, okay? Thinking everything's good, my antivirus software is working fine. Well, you can go back and look at all the zero-day exploits to know it was sitting in there a long time. So zero-day really are the ones that we're most concerned about. How do you see them? How do you detect them? How do you find them? Because they haven't been exploited yet. But you know, the most interesting thing, and most Americans don't really understand this, the most important thing is we've heard the term cyber hygiene, but simple things as malware delivery through spear phishing. So in the Department of Defense, you can't get on one of our computer systems unless you go through a couple hours of minimum training, teaching all the things how people will hack into the Department of Defense. All our emails are stripped of any hyperlink. They're stripped of, they're actually, all the emails that come in are looked at, the source, and if it's not known, you'll never see it. But that one thing is what infects most computers, and I hate to say it, university systems are purveyors of this problem. So a lot of things that are going on in the nation is down in the grade schools, they're starting to teach these kids what not to do, but a lot of Americans still need to get the basic cyber training to avoid allowing someone to infect, through reconning, infect the system so they can start looking in and seeing what they can do. But this is how we kind of look at it. This is how we categorize everything. It's our model, how we look at things. So are these attacks real? Well, you've seen it in the news. Sony, a few years ago, $300 million down the drain. We did, it was attributed to North Korea. How do you view Sony and having all the computer systems taken down and ruined? Is that any different than let's say, a F-16 dropping a bomb on the same facility and doing the same damage? This is the character of way war is being prosecuted in this area is all new. International norms and laws of war really haven't anticipated this. So when you think about attacks on the United States, is that any different than dropping a bomb? I don't know the answer to these questions. And these are serious questions that all nations have to consider as it goes. But 67% of the companies with critical infrastructure suffer an attack. Who's that from? Well, people who kind of, GE does a lot of industrial control systems in everything they do. And then 78% think, hey, it's going to happen in the future. I completely agree with them. And as people's skills become better, we're going to see more of this going on. And that's why this critical infrastructure, which, by the way, we've tried to automate everything. We want everything to be IP-based, Internet of Things. As much as there's goodness in it, it creates security risks. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I want to give you a little perspective of the federal government and how they looked at all this cyber stuff. So DoD was, I would say, the first ones out of the gate. Why? DoD's mission is to defend the United States, period. That's our mission, so keep everybody from attacking the United States in all domains. Well, if you go back to circa 2011, cyber, what's cyber? Well, how does this fit? Well, DoD clearly knew our own systems. We had to protect our own systems. But we're to defend the nation. We have this new domain called cyber. And by the way, 85, 90%, whatever the number is privately held or owned by private corporations, this cyber infrastructure. Pretty hard to defend something you don't control. Many other nation states, on the other hand, it's not privately held. It's controlled by the government themselves. So our problem is unique. And back then, I like this term. We have a Houston problem, Houston. DoD has not conducted a more comprehensive department-wide assessment of cyber-related capability gaps. And you can read the rest of it. But that was just criticizing DoD, let alone what the nation's doing. And this is a government accountability office, and their job is to keep everybody honest, which is great because they do really good work, coming in and assessing how effective are you at your mission. And this was just in the DoD faces challenges in its cyber activities. So the president in 2013 said, hey, and it was done under Executive Order 13636, it's a policy of the United States to enhance the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure and to maintain cyber environment that encourages efficiency, innovation, economic prosperity, and it continues. So we need to protect it, but we also want to innovate. And that's where I think the crux of our challenge is even today. But he started out, but this was the first acknowledgement by the Office of the President, or even, to that matter, the government, that this is a problem. We have to protect this critical infrastructure. Now, keep in mind, I'll go back to 2009. I'm in the Deputy Director's Office of DHS talking about my War College paper, why this is important, that we need to get at that, because I see it as a strategic risk to our very well-being. But this was very important because this spurned a whole bunch of activities. And the first one was in March, just a couple months. Now, obviously, somebody knew it was coming because the Department of Justice and the FBI and DHS and DoD, in a matter of a miracle, 1 month kicked out this chart? I don't think so. This was, they saw this coming, but this was the agreed to federal cybersecurity operations, what the national roles and responsibilities are. And as you look at it, DoD, or DOJ and FBI really were worried about cyber crime. Okay, at the end of the day, investigating cyber crime and obviously supporting the intelligence. Lead for investigation and enforcement. DHS, on the other hand, was to coordinate national protection, prevention, mitigation, and recovery from cyber incidents, the lead for protection of the nation. And DoD was going to be the lead for national defense. And here I put in the middle the National Guard. Where do we fit in all this? Let me talk about that, because I can't presume all of you know how this National Guard thing works. But if you go back to 1636, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we're not a country, we're just a bunch of colonies. Back then, you came to America, you had to defend your own backyard. And back then, it was called the militia. And that's where the militia, well, the militia is today's National Guard. And the concept was communities protect themselves. And in the case now that states protect themselves. And that's what the National Guard does. It's written in the Constitution that every state will have a well-regulated militia. Okay, in charge of the Illinois National Guard, and Randy highlighted, we have about 13,000, about 2,500 are on duty every day. 95% or more of my funding comes from the federal government to be able to fight our nation's wars when called upon. And the other purpose of the National Guard is to be here in case of domestic emergencies and responses on behalf of the governor. I have two bosses. I have the governor of the state of Illinois and I have the president of the United States. I take direction from both of them, okay, through the service chiefs. But at the end of the day, I'm here for the governor and for all of you as citizens of the state. And then correspondingly, we fight our nation's war. There are other reserve components, the Army Reserve, Naval Reserve. They work directly for the president, and they don't worry themselves about domestic. So every state and territory has a National Guard that its foundation was through the militia. In Illinois, it was 1723. In Fort Deschartres along the Mississippi River, we came up with some French, which, by the way, used to own the Louisiana Territory. And there were some outposts, and then the militia in Illinois, which was not a state, but at the time, those folks protected Fort Deschartres. And that's where our founding is, Illinois National Guard. But anyways, back to this. So these two, lead for protection of the nation, lead for national defense. Now as you relate that to cyber, and oh, by the way, government doesn't control but less than 10% of critical infrastructure. How do you defend something you don't control? Tough question. So I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But shared situational awareness was one of the key underlying themes. So we're going to make sure the nation can share awareness of what's going on to protect, prevent, mitigate, respond, and recover from cyber events. So DoD at the time, and probably a little bit ahead of the rest of the government, mostly to protect our own systems, kind of created two ways of looking at cyber. We're going to have offensive cyber operations capabilities and defensive, and then internal defensive measures, and then response actions. And obviously focused on a threat. And this little thing called a CPT, a Cyber Protection Team, I'm going to talk about that capability because it's being stood up in a big way around the country. But I don't want to get into all the details because you're all not sitting in the Department of Defense, but the Department of Defense has offensive and defensive. The National Guard's role in this is solely on the defensive side, unless we're overseas, okay? But this offensive is real, and we have capabilities there. Release authority for an offensive cyber operation is reserved for the president. Only the president can authorize those things. But we do have these capabilities. Why? Because the adversaries have these same capabilities. All right, so that's all going on. Department of Defense, DHS is figuring it out, DOJ is figuring it out. Well, DHS says, hey, wait, the president said we got to protect critical infrastructure. So the National Infrastructure Protection Program of 2013, hey, for the first time outlined who has authorities over what critical infrastructure sectors. And you can see these are the sectors: chemical, commercial facilities, communications, so on and so forth. But in the executive order, it called for the government to closely coordinate with critical infrastructure owners and operators to improve cybersecurity information sharing and develop and implement risk-based approaches to cybersecurity. So now you got the whole of the government kind of moving out on this. And we're going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk about information sharing. How many of you have seen or are familiar with these ISACs? Okay, we got it good. I knew you would know that, Tim. These ISACs were developed really around functional groups, and we have kind of two buckets: critical infrastructure ISACs, and then industry and academic ISACs. And what they do, they're voluntary, they're collective bodies of interested parties to share information related to security, not just solely cybersecurity. That was its initial nexus. But for example, the EISEC, that represents the electric utility industry. Auto ISEC, that's pretty obvious, but you got aviation. Down here you have National Defense ISEC. Those are contractors that work with the National Defense. But these all stood up. And this information sharing and analysis center represented the 95%. I call it 95% because they touch 95% of all industries around the country, trying to share and understand. I mean, we even got one here for the Retail Cyber Intelligence Sharing Center. Remember the Target attacks and all that? Well, there's a group trying to figure out how never to let that happen again that are in the retail sector. So these stood up, all voluntary, but with a common charter and an acknowledgement. And DHS, who provides most of the intel to them, along with the FBI, they'll come and show up and tell the ISAC what they're seeing going on overseas. It's a collaborative environment in which to share information related to these topics. So as a nation, nobody knew how do you get your hands around this cyber thing? And the government turned to NIST, the National Institutes of Standard Technology, said, hey, you need to create a framework for us to think about cybersecurity around critical infrastructure. They published it in 2014. It went out. I think there was a grab to adopt it. I think all the nation really grabbed to adopt this, although I think some people question how valid can you take one framework and apply to all. But there was a lot that moved out on that. And then right now today, there's a draft version 1.1 from February 17, still has not gone final. It just shows you the friction that's going on in this topic around the nation. But obviously, anything in life, if you're not continuously refining based on what you're learning, you're losing. And so this continuous refinement is critical. So DoD in 2015, and if you go back to the March of 13 agreement with Department of Justice, FBI, and DHS, tried to say, what's our strategy relates to cyber security? Now keep in mind, internal to DoD, we already had our own strategy of what we needed to do to protect our own systems. So this was kind of broader because DoD is responsible for what? Defense of the nation. And so this tried to adopt that. Now, as it relates to cyber, you guys probably all heard about United States Cyber Command. They sit side by side with the National Security Agency. The National Security Agency is part of the Department of Defense. Most people don't know that, but they are. And they've always been responsible for intelligence, signal intelligence predominantly. And cyber is a signal type apparatus. But this really, the protection from overseas threats falls in the purview of Cyber Command. The entire Department of Defense is linked up to them, not necessarily working for them, but linked up to them. But once again, this is the mission of the Department of Defense, to deter war and protect the security of our country. Now, some of the tenets of this is three primary missions of the Department of Defense: defend our own network systems and information, defend the homeland and national interests against cyber attacks of significant consequences. This is where critical infrastructure fits into that. And then three, provide cyber support and military operational and contingency plans. So that's our cyber strategy. Boy, that seems really in-depth. You know, it doesn't get to the how. All strategies, if they get into how, they're not strategies. This is just to be an overarching principle. So where does the National Guard kind of fit in this? Right here, in my mind. Now, we're ready to go to war right here and here, but really where the National Guard fits in this whole thing, and it's evolving. So as I go through the rest of the presentation today, I'll give you my thoughts on where I think that's going. But what was decided is by 2018, there's going to be 133 teams completely dedicated to cyber. National mission teams, 13 teams that we're going to establish. Defend the United States and interests against cyber attack of significant consequences. Cyber protection teams is to defend priority DoD networks and systems against priority threats. 68 teams there. National Guard is standing up almost 22 of these teams. And then combat mission teams, combatant commands, the world is divided into 9 geographic combatant command areas. So there's a 4-star general, and he owns that territory. So if there's any war going on in that area, it's his baby, and that's what these combat mission teams do. And then support teams do an analytical and planning support to the national mission and combat mission teams. So this is what the strategy set out to do, and I can tell you what, we're completely on track to achieve this. The National Guard, being unique because we work for the governors and our job is to defend the homeland and protect the states from which we are, created a national cybersecurity strategy that just came out a month and a half ago. But it's not much different than what DoD's is, other than this is Support the warfight. Yep, that's one of the missions we have on the federal side. Protect the homeland by providing highly trained cyber forces available to mission partner requirements. Who's mission partners? Critical infrastructure. That's Rich Hayes' view. Because without critical infrastructure, we don't have our way of life. And then 3, expand and leverage during relationship with private sector, academia, and international partners. So what does this look like in the National Guard? So the National Guard predominantly has 3 missions. Warfight, when needed, get called up to fight our nation's war. Next thing is to protect the homeland, and then partnerships. The National Guard, each state, the 54 states and territories, have partnership with countries around the world. Illinois, in my case, our partner country is Poland. We've had a relationship with Poland since 1993. Poland has provided forces to the fights in Iraq and Afghanistan, Kosovo, and other parts of the world. They don't go unless we go with them. So Illinois National Guardsmen have gone with Poland. We have an immensely tight relationship with them. They're senior general officers. All of us, since '99 is when I first got involved with Poland, we've all kind of grown up together. So we're very tight. Well, when you multiply that by 54 states and territories, and there's 76 total countries, our reach expands the globe. And so these partnerships are pretty key. But those are the 3 things that the National Guard does. But in the cyberspace arena, you can kind of see the breakdown of what we're doing. Mostly it's in cyber protection, okay? But that's our federal mission. It doesn't speak to our mission here in the state. And then obviously in the state cyberspace support, which is protect the homeland, this is where these Title 32, and I don't want to get in, but Title 32 is National Guard, Title 10 is active duty. Just know that. But we have created capabilities for the states to allow the governors to apply the skills, talents, and abilities that the DoDs taught us and apply it to problems that may crop up during emergencies or disaster related to cyber. Now keep in mind, a cyber attack could take down a piece of critical infrastructure for weeks, potentially. And have any of you seen the movie 0 Days? Yeah, okay, so that was a movie about what happened with Stuxnet in Iran. If you haven't seen it, it's a kind of interesting movie, but it talked about all the things that were led up to that and policy issues. It did a deep dive in it, but the bottom line is they destroyed their centrifuge system, and there was going to be a multiple-year rebuild on this thing. It is possible to take down critical infrastructure for a long period of time if you're really sophisticated at it. But we're building this capability and learning how to apply this capability, but once again, it's private sector, so there's some policy and authority issues that we find ourselves confronted with. And then when you talk about our international partners, we've participated with cyber exercises with other nations' militaries. Baltic Ghost is one that's done in the Baltics. We've participated in that, but there's all kinds of things we're doing with our allies and partners to assure that we're protecting our nations, and then obviously learning from each other. Okay, so what are the goals and objectives of the cyber strategy for the National Guard? Well, there's the goals, and I started on the first part, support the warfight, goal 2, and then goal 3. But how are we doing that? Well, to support the warfight, we have to maintain properly manned, trained, and equipped units and develop cyber workforce and expand warfighting capabilities. Okay, that sounds all great. You guys probably, for the most part, won't touch that. But every soldier or airman or Marine or sailor that is given a cyber mission goes through at least about 8 months of core basic and advanced individual training, and then they go away for another 39 weeks, and they learn in detail all kinds of things related to networks, ICS systems, and all the rest of them. These people are amazingly highly trained. The Guard, National Guard's attractive because, and if there's anybody in the room interested, Colonel Mark Sullivan here would love to do it, but you can join the National Guard. This is not a pitch for recruiting, but I just want to illustrate why the National Guard's unique. So many people work in IT arena out in the private sector. To join the National Guard's a part-time responsibility. You bring your civilian acquired skills to the National Guard. We, on top of that, train additional things, and it's a win-win for the nation because we're therefore expanding knowledge base and then putting that same capability back into the private sector. At the same time, it's benefiting defending the nation. Goal 2, information sharing in my mind is critical in anything. You can't solve what you don't know. And we are a bridge in our communities. I mean, I have 54 armories throughout the state. The 13,000, they're in every zip code except for one. So my footprint in the state is everywhere. through our members, through our soldiers and airmen. And that's very powerful in terms of information sharing, but more in sort of building trust and relationships with our communities. And then leveraging private sector, local and regional engagement. My background, I was a CEO of a firm up in Chicago before I came on and did this. I have a vast network of friends that I can tap into. Everybody in the Guard does too. Colonel Sullivan, we all do. And that's immensely powerful. So how do you leverage this to help defend the nation as it relates to anything we do, but in the area of cyber? And so this underpins everything we do, but it has a cyber flavor to it. Most importantly, funds, I told you in the beginning, I get about 95% of my funding from the federal government. Well, with that comes fiscal stewardship. I just can't spend this money on whatever I deem fit. It's directed how I spend this money. So we have to follow legal authorities, fiscal law, in order to spend money. So as it comes to this great cyber capability that we've built for our warfight and defend the nation, how do I collaborate with non-governmental entities, private sector, universities, the state government itself, without getting into fiscal law problems? Well, the Deputy Secretary of Defense back in May of 16 said, hey, we got this great capability to defend the nation. We're going to create a policy that allows you to coordinate, train, advise, and assist non-federal entities. And this is the authority by which I can do training and collaboration. I'll give you an example. Colonel Sullivan's my chief of information. The state cyber capabilities within state government, his teams, network defense teams, have been training with them for well over 2 years now. And have gotten really good with each other to help protect state systems. You heard all about the elections, right? The hacking into the election systems. Well, there's one thing that, let's defend the nation, defend our way of living. This collaboration couldn't have been possible without this memo. And this, in my mind, is critical. Now it expires. You don't have the rest of it. You can Google it. You can find it. It expires March 1st of this year. So that's, it's like the pumpkin in Cinderella, right? But they're going to extend this year, but they want to refine it to help clarify it better, because this was like a shoot over the wall. Let's get this going. Let's get this dialogue going. And but they need to update it because it's a little out of date. So I'm going to try and build this whole slide. But what are other states doing? In the National Guard, we love exercising and training. That's what we do. In the Department of Defense, that's what we do. We train for war. These are state initiatives enabling the strategy that the National Guard put out. And from Maryland, Texas, New Jersey, to Virginia, doing Task Force Echo, there's Virginia National Guardsmen on active duty defending the nation today. There's about 200 guardsmen every day that are doing the Cyber Defend the Nation mission. But Wisconsin just conducted a dark sky event. It was a scenario where the grid was taken down for multiple months. The grid, no electricity, multiple months. How do you recover, and how do we fit in that? So all these training and activities are going on around the nation as we talk about different flavor, different focus. And I bring these up because the only way you're going to win is to collaborate, and it takes the whole of the nation to understand and be involved. And I'm a big fan of, I would say, let people inside the tent. And that relates to cyber and critical infrastructure. That's the only way this is going to really, we're going to improve ourselves in these areas. All right. So where are these cyber forces? You can see everywhere you got green, purple, or blue. That's where cyber forces are in the National Guard, in the Department of Defense. I will tell you, you can see over here, there's 59 units, 39 states. Cyber is a domain that you don't necessarily have to be in a state in order to provide the protection. But this is just the beginning. But if you came to me in 2015, there would have been right here, one state, or two states, Kansas and Washington would have had the only capabilities. This has really been a focus of the Department of Defense to ramp this up. And most of this capability that's not on active duty is worried about outside the continental United States, DHS, FBI, DOJ, inside, National Guard, inside the states. So that's kind of where we fit in this cyber arena. So I'm going to stop there. That was my cyber pitch, what DoD is doing. And I'm going to shift to catastrophes and critical infrastructure with a cyber twist to it. Are there any questions before I continue? Yes, sir.
Many of the vendors that make the control systems and IC systems that rely on proprietary operating systems, from Microsoft. Has there been any effort to work with or talk to those vendors or the infrastructure owners to use open source or more auditable operating systems?
That's a tough question, a good one. Yeah, discussions are occurring, have occurred, will continue to occur with those. Let's just take Apple. You know, the Pasadena situation. They wanted Apple to open the phone, right? The gentleman who did all those attacks. Apple said no. There's a lot of privacy concerns with all this, and I'm not an expert on the legal aspects of all that, but every day the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, interface routinely with those that either own or operate, Google's, Apple's, within the law. And then as it relates to those that manufacture and create, I'll give you an example. If you want to, we got an Apple laptop here. Who's got non-Apple? What kind of laptop do you got there? What's the brand? Lenovo, okay. Department of Defense needs a laptop. Here's the capability requirement. There is nothing that's going to go in our systems that isn't fully checked out, looked at, and if you got a proprietary solution, forget it. We're not going to take it because we've got to assure ours. Well, that's not necessarily true in the private sector. So to answer your question, there's those e-ISACs I told you about, the ISACs, that's where the information shares occur, but private corporations, writ large, that's why they exist. It's profit motive, which is perfectly normal, that's capitalism, but often not, they're not going to want to release their secrets of what makes their juice work. So, okay, so go back to 2005, working engineering construction, critical infrastructure. Okay, well, 2005, in last day of August, what happened in 2005 in New Orleans? Hurricane Katrina. Guess where I was? Ground zero, Hurricane Katrina. I went down shortly thereafter with one of the gentlemen in the room. His father was with me, believe it or not. That was the most eye-opening experience for me in my life from this standpoint. You had an American city that was literally destroyed. Now, it wasn't necessarily the hurricane, it was the flooding that occurred. It destroyed New Orleans. You're down there, everybody was evacuated for the most part. So imagine driving 30 minutes in any direction with no traffic, and everything's destroyed, there's nothing. Nobody's there, every house is under 10 feet of water. Very eerie feeling. It felt like a war zone without any combatants in it. And I walked away from that experience saying, God, this hurricane, those levees broke, flooded everything, ruined the water plant, pumping stations, electrical infrastructure, hospitals, you name it. All this critical stuff, the neighborhood of life, was destroyed by that flood. Now, of course, they've come back after billions of dollars of reinvestment. But that really was my trigger to me, how important critical infrastructure is to us. And in a 24-hour period, a little bit more, 36, that city got destroyed. Well, what happened this year? Puerto Rico. Same thing. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico. A good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Stockton. Anybody know that name? Okay, Tim does. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Affairs, basically, the defense of the United States. And he has been what I would consider one of the drivers for enabling this discussion around developing more resilient critical infrastructure, but when it does fail, being able to recover quickly from such things. And so he's got a PhD, he's a real bright guy, and he decided, hey, let's take Superstorm Sandy and let's overlay a cyber attack on top of it. When do you attack a nation? When you're down at your knees, you just beat yourself down more. So he looked at a post-cyber attack. So you got Sandy going on, and how do you design a post-cyber attack power restoration system? Very interesting read. And he'll give you really good insight of how you take us down even further. But he has been passionate, and he continues to work on this stuff today. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the actions. But you can Google this, you can find it. Very interesting read if you're interested to do that. So here's relevant. Today, September 27th, 2017, Hurricane Maria. Here's the guys at DHS and FEMA sitting in a room going, how do we solve this problem in Puerto Rico? They have no power. Okay, and you can see this is we got power, everything's good, communications. Maria hits, and now we're down to like 10% capacity across all the critical infrastructure. Wow, look at this long road, and they're still coming back up. I was with my counterpart from Puerto Rico last week. They're still struggling to get by this. The power system is still not all the way up. But here's the reality is, how do we solve the problem on a temporary basis? And they knew they had to do spot generation because they couldn't rebuild this infrastructure. So this is where the Corps engineers and all those guys came in running in with generators because they knew they couldn't get the poles up. And then over time, but they sat there. This is just the brainstorming session, how to solve this problem. And they gave 3 strategic goals: restore the communications, okay? And all the criticism in the news and the media about the response, when you're on an island 1,000 miles away from the United States, it's not easy to get stuff to an island. Way different than coming from Illinois and driving down to Texas or driving down to Florida. That was the strategic challenge, was sea lift, airlift. By the way, their airports were challenged, okay, getting planes to land in Puerto Rico to bring stuff in. But the real reality is most of the stuff they needed to recover initially on the life safety aspects was sitting in the ports there. The road network was down. They couldn't get it inside the island. Why? Because nobody could communicate because the cell towers were down. So communication was the first thing. So first thing, communication. You got to get communication. You can't talk, you can't solve problems. 2, restore the backbone of the communications infrastructure, and then restore communication capabilities at critical nodes for the bulk electric power system. Once again, to enable life. Interestingly enough, where do you see water and food in here? Yeah, it's important. I would tell you, you need water to survive. More than 3 days without water, it's a bad deal. Food, I'm sorry, we only got a few extra pounds maybe that we can go. You can go without food for a couple weeks and be okay. And you hear everybody, there's no food. Okay, we understand water's the first priority. But this is what they sat down to just look at the power restoration and how are they going to solve this problem. And this was just a scratch. Now they turned this into a report, but that was just a few folks sitting in a room determining how they're going to prioritize their efforts. So GridX. So the EISAC, well, really NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is responsible for the reliability of the bulk power system. It's not a government entity. It's actually a coalition of the utilities and the independent service operators that form NERC to create reliability standards that apply to the entire operators on the electric grid. NERC really was a big supporter of this EISAC. NERC's still here, but they created this information sharing and analysis center to look at the dynamics of what would happen if we had a large-scale power outage in this country that wouldn't last a week. And in 2003, if some of you remember, a tree hit a line in Ohio, which triggered all these tripping events, brought down the entire East Coast for a day. If you remember pictures of people walking across the Washington Bridge there in New York trying to get home. That was just a tree that fell. But what if we had multiple week, even months power outage on a significant scale? Well, in 2011, they started looking at this inside the utility industry only. And then in 2013, they did a little bit of expansion, pulled a little bit of the government in. But by 2015, I got involved, predominantly because I knew some folks in my civilian capacity, having worked in that, to participate in the GridX3, where they now invited the federal government in to look at the dynamics of that. It was predicated on 2 things: a cyber attack on the electrical systems coupled with physical attacks. Okay, and I can't get into the details of what that all looked like, but those are the 2 things, and it took out 30+ million customers for multiple weeks at a time. And they looked at dynamics, and a couple of interesting things that came out of this to me. So you got about 10 or 15 utility CEOs, the largest utilities in the nation, and some of the small co-ops sitting in there. And they said this: after about 3 or 4 weeks, we're not generating electricity. How are we going to have money to restore the grid? We're going to go bankrupt. Who would have thought of that? Okay. Now, if you look at the Power Authority in Puerto Rico, they pretty much went bankrupt by this event. The federal government had to come in and rebuild the system to get them back on their feet. But that was the one key thing. The other thing is, and you guys all have seen this, they get an ice storm in, I don't know, let's say North Carolina, and what happens? Power lines go down, and what happens? The utilities come running to each other's aid from around the country. It's called mutual aid system. Well, they didn't have any cyber mutual aid for any type of cyber thing. So what was born out of GridX3 was an acknowledgement, hey, we probably should establish capability to have cyber teams that can provide aid to utilities in case we get a bad event at any one utility or multiple utilities. So Edison Electric Institute kicked out on that one. And then GridX4 was this last fall in November. I participated again. And this time I had same kind of scenario, cyber physical attack, more on the physical attack this side, multiple different part of the country. 3,000 utility participants participate in this thing. I mean, it's pretty big. And it's the utility operators looking at the dynamics. If this trunk goes down, how do I manage and balance load? So it's a big deal. But this time it came out of it. Edison Electric Institute did this cyber mutual aid training. Remember, the Department of Defense has to defend the homeland? I asked it, and I was one of four military officers that were in this executive tabletop. How do you expect us to come help enable you to bring this back up? What's our role? I'm asking that how, because I don't own that infrastructure. And the key thing is the cyber mutual aid teams, the Department of Defense, hence the National Guard, should probably start exercising with the utility cyber mutual aid, my cyber capability. So in case of a bad day, the governor has a way to launch that capability to support that entity. The problem is each state has their own laws, and if we do it under the governor's purview, we're known as to be under state active duty, the laws of the state of Illinois dictate what I can and can't do. Well, every state's different. If I'm in a federal status for the president, federal laws kind of prohibit those kind of activities, and we have a big policy issue problem around this. And I can't get into too much of depth, but we have a policy issue problem that we need to really address. But the executive tabletop will be a public report. I have the draft. I can't give it to anybody because it's a draft. But that's going to probably come out in a couple months. The GridX 4 or 3 exercise, it's also on the web. There's a kind of a semi-classified version and unclassed, but you can certainly go out and read these, but you can see the dynamics of why this is such a big deal and why the electric utility industry. But here's what's interesting. Most of the power generation in this country is not coal anymore. It's not nuclear. It's natural gas. Well, if you lose power, what can't you deliver to a power plant? Natural gas. So it's not about just power. There's interdependencies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other thing is the National Governors Association. It's all the governors association that basically represents the states, has tackled on this, and this year did an effort on lessons learned from this GridX. Once again, I participated in that to try and further the discussion of how do we prepare ourselves for critical infrastructure failures. So a couple key DoD exercises that I think are interesting. Colonel Sullivan here certainly participated in a couple, but Cyber Shield is mostly a National Guard Reserve focus, so hence protect the nation. And what is it, Mark, the 4th one they've done, 5th? Somewhere in there? 7th, okay, we're getting far along. This is done annually. Reserve and National Guard forces show up. We create a cyber range, we create a scenario, and there's the good guys and the bad guys, in a simple way of putting it. Some are defending, some are attacking. Very valuable exercise to further skills and abilities. And each year, this year, for example, we brought in some former hackers that had spent time in jail for doing things they shouldn't have been doing to help teach our soldiers and airmen how to be better at doing their jobs. And they're fine now. They're out of jail. They served their time, but a lot of capability there. And then CyberGuard is a whole of government, mostly a federal focus. And that you'll find has opened up the aperture for a lot of private sector to come in and participate in that as well. But this is, these two exercises, key exercises, are designed to bridge the gap between government and the private sector, the people that very much own the critical infrastructure. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions before I continue to talk about resiliency of critical infrastructure? Okay, yes. Thanks.
And
if you have a question, turn on your mic. Thanks, Tim.
I don't know if we're going to cover this soon, but so I'm hopefully future working in the transmission and distribution industry, and a big topic is as the popularity of microgrids gets stronger, there's a large cyber layer on top of these microgrids. Is that something that has been difficult for the government to kind of keep track of? Because as we put a large cyber layer over these distributed energy resources, that now we're open to a lot of vulnerability both inside and outside the country. Has that been difficult for the government to kind of keep track of because it's such a new idea coming into the industry, or is that something that's been kind of established and talked about for a while?
All right, I'm going to answer this. I'm going to give you my opinion on this, okay? I'm not representing the government in any way on this. I don't think it's the government's business to be in the private sector space as it relates to what works for the private sector. You know, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework for Critical Infrastructure was designed to provide some operating principles. My own background, a lot of SCADA and ICS related to high voltage transmission substations. Everything was dedicated fiber. There was nothing that was going to touch that dedicated fiber. It was never going to touch the internet. Most of that infrastructure is that way today. However, all it takes is a technician to show up with his laptop, put the USB key in, get rid of all your USB keys, don't use them, bad juju. Put it in there and can load malware in there inadvertently and then somehow affect it. It's a big challenge. And I don't have an answer for it, but industry needs to partner. But part of it is the government's role is to inform on threats. That's a key mission of I think the government is to inform what's going on, what are the threats that are affecting us. A lot of times though we find that the threats are actually better seen down in the private sector. They just don't know what to do with it, or they don't know what they're looking at. That's a tough question, but it creates dialogue. And I can tell you that NERC in the EISAC, they are dead set to make sure the electric industry is as well protected as possible from exactly what you say. I think the Internet of Things is going to complicate all this. It creates so many nodes you can't keep your head straight on where they're connecting. Any more before we go on? Okay. So I want to talk about recent critical infrastructure resiliency efforts beyond CIRI, although I'm going to do a plug for CIRI when I'm done. Argonne National Labs up in Northern Illinois has a mission for the Department of Energy of critical infrastructure writ large as a whole. And they recently published this, and I like this document. It's one of the documents that helped wrap the topic, I thought, pretty effectively. So, but it's called the State Energy Resilience Framework. It's designed really for state governments to help start having a discussion with the private sector. I mean, if I was to nail it down, because state government outside of their own facilities really doesn't own any critical infrastructure of any substance, except for probably the water sector. We all get drinking water, and that's usually a government-owned capability. But what I liked about it is it kind of forced everybody to think about, how do you approach collaborating on this thing? Well, you got to understand who the stakeholders are. Who's skin in the game on this? Okay, what are the threats and hazard and the vulnerabilities of these systems? And you can't look at them in isolation. To your point, you're talking about, you can't just look at the bulk power system. You got to look across all of them. How do you develop a resilience plan? I think a lot of stuff that CIRI is doing, and some of the research I've seen out of CIRI, is trying to get at this question. How do you develop a resilience plan? Now, we can talk about our house, right? Anybody in the room have an emergency backup generator at their house? Okay, we got a few people, right? Why? You're worried about when the power goes down, right? So you built a resilient potential system. It's good as long as there's fuel to run it, right? So you're dependent on the fuel systems that deliver it. So, you know, when you talk about developing a resilience plan, it takes on multiple forms, then implementing it, and then reviewing and making, and it's just kind of a do loop, you know, continuously go through this do loop. So it was designed really to prompt discussion amongst the states. Now, the National Governors Association has done a lot of white papers on these topics, but I thought they really kind of got at the crux. And then what I liked most about it was this slide. And I talked about Dr. Stockton. If he was here, he'd talk this slide for hours of the interdependencies of critical infrastructure. Yep, you need power to have water, telecom, oil, natural gas, and transportation systems. You have to. But by the way, electric power needs natural gas, and so they're all interdependent. And this is one thing that I would say is a critical mission for CIRI to try and figure out with the rest of the nation. How do we understand these interdependencies? And you just asked me a tough question, and it's why? Because everybody's doing things that work for them. You know, if you look at the electric grid, Thomas Edison decided, I'm going to, invent the electric bulb and electricity. Well, you built a little power plant, steam fire's got a little generator, and I'm going to sell you electricity to your house. And then you want it, and you want it, and you want it. Well, this is how it got built. They built little power plants. Manufactured gas plants were what really took off the electricity. They just started building wires out. And then what happens next is, I got my electric utility, and Randy Sandone's got his, and now our wires are touching. We're arguing over which customers we're going to get. And then we realized, hey, sometimes my systems go down. Maybe we should connect our wires and have a way to share load at times. So we did that. And then it was, well, wait a minute, your system's designed different than me. Yeah, I understand that, but we'll just create a capability, a substation that can deal with both of our powers the way we've designed it. oh, by the way, maybe I don't need to build another power plant. Maybe we build a power plant together and we share the juice that comes off of it. So the electric industry started out really everybody doing their own thing. And the beauty of it, in a way, is that there's all these divergent electrical engineering standards amongst the utility. Subtle to most people, but for yourself who was in power engineering over here, I'm sure you understand those little nuances make a difference. That created complexity, but that same complexity also protects this nation, because it's hard for someone to understand our power system. Everybody remembers Ukraine a couple years ago, right? The power system was taken down. State-owned utility, designed, constructed all the same way. Some bad guys got in the tent and took it down. Why? It was easy for them. Ours is very difficult because everybody's doing their own thing. So there's good and bad, but the bottom line is that good part makes this overtly complex to understand our own system to try and protect it. And that's why I think, and I love this chart because it really gets at the core of, I think, the problem that we have to confront. As much as I look at it and I go, I feel a little bit better than being like a Ukraine where you're exposed because you can see how you're designed. But at the core of all this, communication wraps all those together. If you don't have communications, you're not talking. And the advent of really IP-based systems requires that you have communication backbone and network. And as much as goodness as that has given us, it also has created an immense amount of vulnerabilities. So I always put up this CIRI, and I know it's housed here at the University of Illinois, and it's a collaboration of many around the nation, but I sit on the external advisory board, as Randy pointed out, but I like to put this up. I've talked to audiences all over the country about this. Why? Because I think this is so important, and I think the mission of what they're doing. Because if we don't get at this and don't understand it, and obviously we have some students in the room, but we're not doing enough in this area. I can tell you, I can look at critical infrastructure and I can devise a plan. Don't let me fight the bad guy. Let me go after the bad guys, because I could really wreak havoc in another country because of my technical knowledge. Well, I'm clearly not alone. Our adversaries have the very same technical people, which raises a very important issue for me. The military, everything we do is conducted under the laws of war. We don't get to just do anything we want. There's the laws of war. And those were established in the Hague Convention and follow-on agreements. But we fight wars really where we are limited by the amount of damage we can do, or especially collateral damage. So if anyone in the audience is the bad guy, I can engage the bad guy. But I can't engage those that are not combatants, those that are not wearing the uniform. And if you think about critical infrastructure enables everybody's way of life, and I don't care what part of the world you're from. So to attack critical infrastructure in and of itself is not a target, it's not a combatant. Those that wear the uniform are combatants, and the world's gotten more complex because now we have the problem of asymmetric warfare. We can't tell who our enemies are. Just take ISIS, take Al-Qaeda. They're not wearing uniforms, they don't identify themselves. But to attack critical infrastructure, in my mind, and the laws of war, harms non-combatants, and it would be an illegal act. And the U.S. government and the U.S. military, especially military operations, when we do targeting, lawyers are standing over you going, looking and thinking about those things. But non-state actors, okay, who don't care about any of that stuff, can impart. So they don't care about the laws of war. They never did. So I see that as one of the key reasons why normal nation state, even let's just take Russia, for example. We've been friendly with Russia over the last 20, now our relationship seems to be souring, okay? But even Russia adheres, for the most part, to the laws of war and would come to the same conclusion: we shouldn't attack critical infrastructure in the United States if we go to war, because that would affect non-combatants. But that our adversaries that are not state actors, that don't believe in these laws of war, don't adhere to those same standards. And that's why I see this risk. This risk, we didn't have a whole bunch of terrorist organizations 40 years ago. We just didn't. Now we do. And they're going to do anything they can to affect us. And I think CIRI's mission is not necessarily the technical one. It's looking at the whole breadth of this complex problem. Another group I'm part of is the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. This is a worldwide organization that really looks at black sky events. Doesn't matter what causes them. Take a geomagnetic storm that would take out the grid. I think it was 2012, we were 9 days away from probably taking out the grid in the whole east half of the United States because we missed a solar flare that would have just had a real wreaked havoc. And that would have been a multi-month or maybe year-long, 9 days. Didn't get publicized because nothing happened, right? You can't worry about it. But those solar flares, so electromagnetic pulse, you've heard of that? Well, typically that's generated by a nuclear weapon. Well, guess what? Not anymore. EMP devices can be made. And obviously focused and localized, but they can destroy electrical. And the fact that we've driven most of our society to microelectronics, real small things, they're the easier of the electronic components to take out by EMP. But EIS is really looked at, and they've created a line of books called EPRO, a series of books. But you can go to their website, EISI Council. But I've been involved for a handful of years, and we sit, and Israel, Britain, all these countries show up, people with an interest, not in the electric sector, it started out that way, but across interdependent sectors, water sector, gas sector, electric, so on. And we talk about what happens if we have a black sky event. How do we mitigate ahead of time from having to recover from those? But then how do we recover? And every time I go to these forums, every time we have a catastrophe in the United States, what happens? National Guard gets called out, right? There's down at Katrina, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Texas, Florida. We get called out because we have to deal with the humanitarian aspects of the crisis. But at the end of the day, the key thing is to get infrastructure back up. So they are completely fixated and focused on how do we create better strategies in bringing critical infrastructure back up. Something that was done last year, I put this up because everybody in the room can participate in this exercise. The ASI Council does EarthX. And it's designed to look at the dynamics of a post grid failure, black sky event. And last year they had more than 3,000 participants. But it wasn't just people in the industry. It was homemakers, students. It was the whole gamut of society that participated in it. This was the third one they did. They went to 3,000. They expect this maybe go upwards of 15,000 people this year. But they're taking that, gaining the perspectives of the whole of society, not just here in the United States, worldwide, to look at the dynamics. And they create a scenario. So if you go out to the EIS website, or if you print these slides, you'll see it's going to be on August 22nd. But it takes everybody's insights to get this right, I think. So key themes I kind of went over, and I'm going to come back to your question, sir, here in a minute. Our economy, in my mind, is the center of gravity for the United States. Center of gravity is defined as a thing that makes everything else happen. Some people can argue with me, but I firmly believe that, and it relies on critical infrastructure. So if you don't have critical infrastructure, you don't have our economy, and therefore you don't have a center of gravity. And a lot of people say, well, our center of gravity is our military. Yes, we have a great military, but our military isn't everything. It just defends the nation. And yes, it'd be unlikely that someone's going to beat us at our own game today. I always worry about tomorrow. But the reality is that's not what we're about. It's not about the military. It's about the nation. The economy provides for it. You know, when you think about a critical capability, well, that is critical infrastructure. And then when I know this, large, long-scale duration infrastructure failures guaranteed to create humanitarian crises. And cyber is unique with this proliferation of technology, proliferation of internet things. You're opening up the door for someone who can be the other side of the world, and in a matter of speed of light, can take something down. It's a domain in which to attack our economy, basically, by attacking critical infrastructure. And then our response to the attacks is critical to protecting the center of gravity. And obviously our National Guard plays a future critical role. But I would say this, everyone needs to care and be involved, okay? I mean, how many in the room camp? Raise your hand if you go camping. Pretty austere, right? You gotta sleep on a sleep ground, sleep tank. You have a flashlight maybe, no electricity. You bring your water, you bring your food. Imagine you have to go hunt your own food. You gotta somehow purify your own water. Those things we just don't do. Well, if we don't have critical infrastructure, we're not going to enjoy that. So that's why I think everybody needs to be involved. And I think we need to focus on protection of it and the interdependencies and how they work so we can understand those. So I wanted to say this, so why should we be concerned? Because I see this as a risk to national continuity. I firmly believe that. And be honest with you, I go back to 2012, 9 days away from taking out the grid on the east coast, the east half of the United States. The west half would be trying to help us. When you're talking 150, 200 million people without water, without food, we're not used to that kind of stuff. So it's not necessarily, it's not only can happen by a non-state actor or a state actor, but it's something we need to really think about how to become more resilient, because it really does provide for what we have. So with that, now I'd like you to ask your question one more time, and I'm going to do it.
About the
Insider threat.
insider, not just the nation states direct journal.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the Department of Defense, through U.S. Cybercom, NSA, and Defense Intelligence Agency, and CIA have the responsibility looking for the intel warnings and indicators of what's coming to the United States, and taking that intelligence and giving it to the Department of Defense to do something with it. Inside the United States, inside stuff, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has that, but in the case of Illinois, the Illinois State Police has a state intelligence center. And through those ISACs, okay, they all collaborate. So there's information sharing between Illinois State Police, FBI, Department of Defense, City of Chicago, County Police. It all flows through that information sharing and analysis center. So that's how we do it. Inside our own organization, we have an insider threat program inside National Guard. Colonel Sullivan is part of that, but through our training, credentialing, I mean, to be honest with you, we all have CAC cards. I probably know what a CAC card is, but it's nothing more with a card, a chip. It's like your credit card with a chip on it. You can't get onto our systems without minimum that factor authentication. There's barriers and controls. You can't get into secret facilities. You can't go to all of that, but we are very locked down, much more so than most rest of the nation. I think that's another area of cyber hygiene. We need to really have some way to assure that you are who you say you are on the internet. Right now, if I have your login credentials, who knows? It could be anybody, and that's a big problem. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir. You turn on your mic so we can hear you.
Who might you say is the leader in water resource management in the Midwest in this regard?
Well, let's put it this way. I know the water sector is represented by the American Water Association. They collaborate and are part of EIS. They're part of the GridX. They were there this year. Water is predominantly owned by municipal systems. There's a couple, I think American Water Corporation is one of them. There are a couple people that play in that space. I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, they've really gotten engaged on this. Obviously, they deal with a lot of chemical, a lot of mixing systems, all IP-based mixing systems. So they're taking this very seriously. But to your answer, that's not my particular area, no, but I know the American Water Association. Water and Wastewater Association is heavily engaged in this area. All right, any other questions? Do we have any questions online? All right, the folks online just must have answered all their questions. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you. I know this wasn't super techy. I never intended it to be. But walking away, I'm really worried about this. And you guys should be too. And a lot of your backgrounds, the folks in the room, you're going to have an ability to assure, I'm going to call it the survival of the nation and national continuity by caring enough to look after our critical infrastructure and to recognize that cyber, this cyber domain that we've created, this wonderful thing that has really propelled the world farther, faster, and will continue to do so, is an amazing capability. So how do you find the right balance between protecting this and also enabling all these great technologies that enhance our lives? So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.